avant de commencer, je tiens à souligner que le Parlement du Canada est situé sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin. I've just come from the House of Commons where I introduced Bill C-38, which proposes amendments to address some of the remaining inequities in the registration and band membership provisions of the Indian Act. These amendments to the Indian Act would address 4 key areas, including enfranchisement, individual deregistration, natal band reaffiliation and membership, and outdated and offensive language related to dependent persons. J'arrive tout juste de la Chambre des communes où j'ai présenté aujourd'hui le projet de loi C-38 qui propose des modifications visant à corriger certaines des inquiétudes qui subsistent dans la disposition de la loi sur les Indiens relative de l'inscription et l'appartenance à une bande. Ces modifications à la loi sur les Indiens porteraient sur 4 aspects: l'émancipation, la radiation individuelle, la réaffiliation de l'appartenance à la bande natale, et la langue désuète et offensante relative aux personnes en charge. The legislation responds to long-standing concerns raised by First Nations and other individuals affected by the Indian Act's residual discriminatory impacts. Let's be clear, the Indian Act is a colonial piece of legislation, and while some changes have been made, more are necessary. Bill C-38 seeks to ensure First Nations individuals with family histories of enfranchisement are entitled to registration under the Indian Act and can pass this on to their descendants to the same degree as those families without histories of enfranchisement. Now, enfranchisement was a practice of removing someone from the Indian registry for marrying a non-Indian, or for getting a university degree, or by application to access the rights of Canadian citizenship. This was also a method by some people to avoid the experience of attending a residential school. Enfranchisement was removed from the Act in 1985 through C-31, but family members of those who were enfranchised haven't had the same entitlements as other First Nations families. And this bill, if passed, would allow for those family members to register. The legislation is part of our commitment to reach a legal agreement outside of the courts for the plaintiffs represented in the Nicholas Charter Challenge. We expect 3,500 individuals will be newly entitled to registration as a result of these proposed amendments. They would also provide a legal mechanism enabling women to reaffiliate with their natal bands should they choose to. This will benefit the First Nations women and their descendants whose membership in their natal bands was changed without their say. The amendments would also return autonomy to First Nations people by allowing them to deregister or to remove their name from the Indian Register if they wish. Individuals will have the legal capacity to exercise agency over their status, which unbelievably has not been available to date. It is part of our duty to respond to rights holders through engagements and consultations, and over the past number of years we've been doing that. It's also a responsibility to take action on the findings of these consultations and experts' reports. As I said, this is part of the ongoing work needed, and it must be sustained to eliminate outstanding concerns of gender-based discrimination and inequalities while also addressing colonial laws and structures. At the end of the day, this bill is about people, First Nations people who suffered discrimination and who shouldn't have. To provide just one example of what these changes could mean for individuals, I'll share an example. And I want to thank Nadia Salmanou, one of the plaintiffs in the Nicholas Charter Challenge, for allowing us to share her story. Nadia, whose Haida name is Sanam Guaz, her brother and now her daughter have lived with the discriminatory historic impacts of enfranchisement. Nadia's great-grandfather, Wilfred Laurier Bennett, gave up his Indian Act status and entitlements through enfranchisement to protect his family from the experience of residential schools. Mr. Bennett himself had been forced to attend the Kokalitsa residential school. She explained his decision like this. Nadia said, "It's said in stories that he returned from the residential school a broken man. I can only imagine what he experienced there, and he wanted to protect his children from it. He made, I believe, a forced decision to protect his children because he himself had been forced into residential school, and he knew of the atrocities and the horrors that his children would have endured if they had gone. I knew in a heartbeat I would do that for my young girl." Because her great-grandfather enfranchised, Nadia and her younger brother have been denied status multiple times. This is despite being entitled to Haida citizenship under the laws of Haida Nation and being status members of the Tlingit and Haida tribes of Alaska. Nadia and her daughter are both Eagle Clan members as recognized by the Old Masset Village Council, one of 2 Haida Indian Act bands. She further said, "To receive a denial letter from the Government of Canada saying that you're not Indigenous when you know that's who you are is deeply, deeply impactful. I believe that just opened up the old wounds and continued to reinforce the harm that was inflicted on my great-grandfather at the time of residential school. What an ultimate act of colonization. If we were successful in having that harm recognized through a change in the law, I would be joyful because actively I would have been a small part of the change I wish to see in the world and for the generations to come as I raise my daughter as a proud Haida girl." Nadia's experience brings to life why we're bringing forward these proposed amendments. On a technical level, these changes will allow individuals to reclaim status, but more fundamentally, they right the wrongs, the historic wrongs of robbing people of their heritage, their culture, and their identity. And there's way more to do. It's also why we're launching co-developed consultations in 2023 to look at other areas that still need to be addressed, including issues of second-generation cutoff. I've heard very clearly from First Nations partners that this is a priority when it comes to the Indian Act and status, and that's why we'll continue to consult with First Nations people about how to move forward. I want to conclude by saying that by introducing this bill today, it's just one step in a process of reconciliation. We have to keep going. And I hope that parliamentarians and First Nations partners will help us through the legislative process. We will have an opportunity to discuss amendments and work through committee stages in both houses. I hope that it's an opportunity for all members to understand the importance of this journey together. Thank you very much.
Hey.
Hi.
I guess you're taking my questions. I don't know if I'll see anybody else, but anyway, I guess what I'd like to, this is sort of on behalf of my colleague, but lingering discrimination within the Indian Act has been an issue for at least 3 decades. And every time there's a court ruling, Canada's forced to amend registration within the Act, but then discrimination and inequalities always remain. How do these new amendments address that? I mean, I know you brought up the 4 different groups of people who will be able to register for Indian Act status, but what's to say that 2 years down the road we don't find another group of people who also qualify? How do we stop playing this game of whack-a-mole?
Well, I think fundamentally, first of all, the Indian Act is a colonial racist piece of legislation that all people want to see removed from the law books of Canada. However, many First Nations also know that there are protections within the Act that need to remain until self-determination tools are fully developed to the perspective that First Nations feel sufficiently protect those rights that they have enshrined in the Act and in other pieces of legislation. In terms of disenfranchisement, I know this isn't the end. In fact, many people that I personally have spoken with are concerned about what's commonly referred to, and I made this comment in my speech, the second generation cutoff. That is grandchildren of people that are descendants of people with status on either the maternal or the paternal side. It's a complicated space because, of course, status and identity and First Nations membership are all unique and distinctive, and yet are woven together. And so that's why we're launching these consultations in 2023 to get at the specific question of how to do that work delicately, respectfully, and in full partnership with First Nations.
how many people do you figure are going to be covered by these four groups?
About 3,500 is our best estimate.
3,500. And what kind of process are they going to have to go through to regain their status?
Well, there's a process that the department completes with individuals where there is an application involved. Ultimately, some of these folks have gone through that process a number of times and been denied. And so I would expect that the department will be working with individuals that have been denied that fit in these categories to expedite that process and make it as painless as possible.
Is there going to be a cutoff time or like a deadline for people to apply, that sort of thing?
There will not be.
No? Okay. Those are all my questions. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.